Have you ever felt like the world just doesn't see you? Like you fought battles no one else can understand, only to be pushed aside as if you're invisible? What if, in your darkest moment, a tiny, unexpected gesture could shatter the walls you've built around your heart? In a small corner of America, where the stars and stripes wave proudly over diner windows and picket fences, a story unfolded that no one saw coming. A story of pain, of quiet wars fought within, and a moment so raw it would leave even the toughest soul trembling. Stick around, because what happened in that little cafe on a chilly autumn morning in upstate New York will make you believe in the power of humanity all over again. Under the grey, heavy skies of a late October morning, Jim Carter sat alone at the edge of a worn-out booth in Rosie's Diner, a small joint just off Route 9 in Poughkeepsie. The air carried the sharp bite of fall, the kind that sneaks through the cracks of old windows and chills you to the bone. Jim's hands, rough and calloused from years of gripping rifles and rebuilding his life, wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee. The steam rose in lazy curls, but his eyes, hollow, distant and grey as the Hudson River outside, stared right through it. He didn't hear the clatter of plates or the hum of chatter around him. Jim hadn't heard much of anything since the blast in Kandahar took his hearing 12 years ago. A purple heart pinned to his past, a silent world as his present. He wore a faded army jacket, the kind you'd see on any veteran in these parts, olive green and patched at the elbows. The insignia of the 101st Airborne was still faintly visible, though the threads had frayed with time. Beneath it, a plain white t-shirt clung to a frame that once stood tall and unbreakable, but now hunched slightly, as if carrying an unseen weight. His face, weathered beyond his 42 years, bore the scars of war, both the visible ones, like the jagged line across his left cheek, and the invisible ones that flickered in his eyes when a car backfired outside or a door slammed too loud. Jim had come back to Poughkeepsie after the war, to the town where he'd tossed footballs in the park with his buddies and kissed his high school sweetheart under the 4th of July fireworks. But the town hadn't welcomed him back the way he'd hoped. People nodded politely, sure, but their eyes always darted away too quickly, as if his silence made them uncomfortable, as if he was a reminder of something they'd rather forget. Every morning, Jim walked the half-mile from his tiny apartment above the hardware store to Rosie's. It wasn't for the coffee, though he'd never admit it. It was for the illusion of connection, for the fleeting glances of familiarity from the regulars who tipped their hats or mumbled a mornin' before turning back to their newspapers. He'd sit there scribbling notes on a worn notepad, one of the few ways he communicated since he never quite got the hang of lip-reading, and watch life move around him like a silent movie. Outside, the leaves blazed in fiery shades of red and gold, piling up along the cracked sidewalks where kids in hoodies kicked through them on their way to school. The diner smelled of greasy bacon and maple syrup, a scent as American as apple pie, and the jukebox in the corner occasionally crackled to life with an old Johnny Cash tune, though Jim only felt the vibrations through the table. This was his routine, his attempt at normalcy, a fragile thread holding together the pieces of a man who'd left too much of himself on a battlefield halfway across the world. But beneath the surface, Jim was fraying. He'd learned to live with the silence, adapted to a world where sound was just a memory. But the real war raged inside. Flashbacks crept in without warning, images of sand and smoke, of brothers falling, of a life he'd never get back. He'd wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. He didn't talk about it, not that he could easily anyway, but the ache was etched into every line on his face. In a drawer at home, buried under old bills and takeout menus, sat a stack of letters from his platoon buddies, some unopened, some read 100 times over. Letters that reminded him of promises to make it home together, promises broken by roadside bombs and sniper fire. Jim had survived, but survival felt like a punishment some days. He'd tried to move forward, even applied for a job at the local VA hospital to help other vets, but the rejection letter still sat on his kitchen counter, a silent thanks, but no thanks. So he came to Rosie's day after day, clinging to a routine that kept him from unraveling completely, hiding the storm behind a stoic nod and a forced half-smile. That morning, though, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the air seemed heavier, or how the diner felt a little emptier than usual, with only a handful of early birds nursing their coffees. Jim adjusted the collar of his jacket against the draft, sneaking through the window, and scribbled a quick note to Rosie about needing a refill. He slid the notepad across the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, when a sudden commotion caught his eye. A group of young guys, barely out of their teens, stumbled into the diner, their laughter loud enough to make the old-timers at the counter shoot them dirty looks. Jim couldn't hear their words, but he saw the way they swaggered, all bravado and energy, tossing a football between them like they owned the place. One of them, a lanky kid with a backward cap, bumped into Jim's table as he passed, knocking over the salt shaker. The kid barely glanced back, just muttered something Jim couldn't catch and kept walking. Jim's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, didn't write anything, didn't gesture. He just righted the shaker, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, a flicker of frustration or maybe shame passing through him. It was a small thing, barely a blip, but to Jim, it felt like a spotlight on everything he'd lost, on how he couldn't even bark out a quick, "Watch it," like any other guy would. He turned his gaze back to the window, trying to shake it off, focusing on the way the morning mist hung low over the Hudson in the distance. That's when he noticed her, a tiny figure, bundled in a bright pink coat, hopping down the sidewalk outside with a woman who must have been her mom. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6, her braids bouncing with every skip, a stuffed bunny swinging from her hand. She stopped abruptly, pressing her face against the diner's foggy glass, her breath creating little clouds as she peered inside. Her eyes, wide and curious, locked onto Jim's for a split second before her mom tugged her along, disappearing around the corner. Jim didn't think much of it at first, just another fleeting moment in a day full of them, but something about the girl's stare lingered, like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples he couldn't quite place. Minutes ticked by, the diner settling back into its sleepy rhythm. Jim sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and sketched absent-mindedly on his notepad a rough outline of a mountain range he'd seen in Afghanistan, jagged and unforgiving. He was lost in the strokes of his pencil when the bell above the door jingled again. He didn't look up right away, figuring it was just another regular, until a small shadow fell across his table. There she was, the little girl in the pink coat standing right in front of him, her bunny tucked under one arm. Her mum hovered a few steps behind, looking a bit frazzled, but offering a sheepish smile. The girl's face was alight with something Jim couldn't decipher, a kind of determination that seemed too big for such a small person. Before he could react, before he could grab his notepad to ask what she wanted, she did something that stopped him cold. She raised one tiny hand, her fingers moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. American Sign Language. "Thank you," she signed, her movements a little clumsy but unmistakable. Then, with a shy grin, she added, "For fighting." Jim's world tilted. His heart slammed against his ribs, a rush of heat flooding his chest as memories he'd buried clawed their way to the surface. How did she know? Why did she care? And why, after all these years of feeling invisible, did this tiny stranger see him? Really see him, in a way no one else had? His eyes burned, a lump rising in his throat as he stared at her, unable to move, unable to look away as the weight of every unspoken battle crashed over him like a tidal wave. In that frozen moment, Jim didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. What this little girl carried with her, what she would reveal next, would crack open the armor he'd worn for over a decade and leave him wondering if maybe, just maybe, he could find his voice again. Jim sat frozen, his rough hands trembling on the edge of the table, the chipped mug of coffee forgotten as the little girl's small, deliberate signs echoed in his mind. "Thank you. For fighting." Those words, unspoken but seen, sliced through the walls he'd built over 12 long years. His chest tightened, a raw ache spreading like wildfire. And for the first time in forever, he felt the sting of tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to push them back, but the weight of her gesture was too much. How could someone so small, someone who couldn't possibly know the battles he'd fought, see straight into the hollow space where his heart used to be? He wanted to look away, to hide behind the stoic mask he'd perfected, but her wide, innocent eyes held him captive. They weren't filled with pity or discomfort like the gazes he was used to. They were filled with something pure, something he hadn't seen in years. Gratitude. And it hurt. It hurt because he didn't feel worthy of it, not after everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to save. Inside, a storm raged. Jim's mind spiraled back to Kandahar, to the blast that stole his hearing and so much more. He saw the faces of his brothers, Danny, who'd promised to name his first kid after Jim, and Marcus, who'd always cracked jokes to keep morale up. Gone. All gone. And here he was, the one who made it back, sitting in a diner in Poughkeepsie, a shell of the man he'd been, while a 6-year-old thanked him for something he couldn't even forgive himself for. Guilt clawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. He hadn't fought hard enough, hadn't been fast enough. If he'd just moved a split second sooner on that dusty road, maybe Danny would still be here to meet his kid. Maybe Marcus would be tossing a football with those loud kids at the other table, instead of being just a name on a cold stone in Arlington. Jim's breath hitched, his fingers curling into fists under the table. He didn't deserve thanks. He deserved the silence, the isolation, the way the world had turned its back on him, or so he'd told himself every day since coming home. The girl's mom stepped closer, her expression a mix of apology and uncertainty. She placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, murmuring something Jim couldn't hear, but the girl didn't budge. She kept looking at him, her shy grin unwavering, as if waiting for him to respond. Jim fumbled for his notepad, his hands unsteady. But what could he write? What words could possibly match the weight of what she'd just done? He scribbled a quick "thank you" and slid the paper toward her, but it felt empty, inadequate. His throat was tight, his thoughts a tangled mess of shame and confusion. Why did this hurt so much? Why did her kindness feel like a punch to the gut instead of a lifeline? He avoided her gaze, staring instead at the worn-out tabletop, at the faint ring of coffee stains that marked countless mornings of sitting alone. But the girl didn't move. She tilted her head, her little fingers fidgeting with the ear of her stuffed bunny, and then, in a shaky but determined motion, she signed again. "Oh, you're brave." Those two words hit harder than any explosion. Jim's vision blurred, and this time he couldn't stop the tear that slipped down his scarred cheek. He turned his head quickly, hoping no one saw, but the diner felt like it was shrinking around him. The old-timers at the counter, the waitress wiping down the coffee machine, even the rowdy kids in the corner, it was as if they were all watching, seeing him crack open for the first time in years. He felt exposed, raw, like a wound that had never healed was suddenly torn wide. Brave? He didn't feel brave. He felt broken, a man who'd survived a war only to lose the battle with himself every single day. But this tiny stranger believed in him, saw something he couldn't see, and it was tearing him apart. The tension in the diner thickened as the mom finally knelt beside her daughter, her voice soft but firm as she spoke to the girl. Jim couldn't catch the words, but he saw the way the woman glanced at him, her eyes carrying a flicker of understanding. Or maybe it was pity. He couldn't tell anymore. The girl nodded reluctantly, but before she turned to leave, she reached into her pink coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She hesitated, then placed it on Jim's table, her small hand lingering for a moment, as if making sure he'd take it. Then, with a final wave, she let her mom guide her toward the door, the bell jingling as they stepped back into the chilly October morning. Jim stared at the paper, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. What could it be? Why did it feel like a grenade waiting to detonate? He didn't want to open it, didn't want to face whatever new weight it might carry, but his fingers moved anyway, unfolding it with a slowness that betrayed his dread. It was a drawing scribbled in crayon with the unsteady lines of a child's hand. A stick figure in green, clearly meant to be him, with a rough sketch of an army jacket, stood tall on one side of the page. Next to him was a smaller figure in pink, holding what looked like a bunny. Above them, a big yellow sun smiled down, and scrawled at the top in messy letters were the words, "My Hero." Jim's breath caught, a soundless gasp escaping him as his grip on the paper tightened. The simplicity of it, the unfiltered honesty, shattered something deep inside. He wasn't anyone's hero, not his own, not his brother's, and certainly not this little girl's. Yet here it was, in bright, waxy colors, a truth she believed with all her heart. His hands shook as he folded the drawing back up, slipping it into his jacket pocket, as if hiding it could hide the emotions threatening to spill over. But they didn't stop. Memories flooded in. Times he'd held dying friends in his arms, times he'd written letters home promising he'd make it back, times he'd stared at himself in the mirror and seen nothing but a ghost. The drawing was a mirror of a different kind, showing him a reflection he didn't recognize, one he wasn't sure he could accept. As Jim sat there, wrestling with the storm inside, Rosie approached, her apron dusted with flour, a fresh pot of coffee in hand. She'd been watching from behind the counter, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and now she slid into the booth across from him, her lined face softening. She didn't say anything at first, just poured him a refill, the steam rising between them like a fragile veil. Then she tapped the table to get his attention and pointed to her lips, making sure he could read her words. "That little girl, Lily. She's been asking about you for weeks. Saw you through the window one day, noticed the jacket. Her grandpa was a vet too. She learned sign language at school 'cause of him. He lost his hearing later in life. She wanted to talk to you herself." Rosie paused, her expression heavy with something unspoken. "Her grandpa passed last month. I think seeing you means something big to her." Jim's jaw clenched, his eyes dropping to the coffee, as Rosie's words sank in. So that was it. Lily wasn't just thanking him. She was reaching for a connection, a piece of her grandpa she'd lost through a stranger in a faded army jacket. It made the drawing in his pocket feel even heavier, like it carried not just her hope, but her grief too. He wanted to be angry, to push back against being someone's stand-in, but all he felt was a deep, aching sadness. For Lily, for her grandpa, for himself. He picked up his pen, scribbling a shaky response on his notepad. "Didn't know. Didn't mean to. I'd be that for her." Rosie read it, her mouth pressing into a thin line, and she shook her head slightly, reaching across to tap his hand, a gesture of comfort he hadn't felt in too long. "You don't get it, Jim," she said, her lips moving slowly so he could follow. "You being here, just showing up every day, it matters. More than you think. She's not the only one who sees you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with subtext, and Jim felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Was it hope, or just another weight to carry, knowing he mattered to someone when he felt so unworthy of it? Rosie stood, giving him a small nod, before heading back to the counter, leaving him alone with thoughts that churned like the muddy waters of the Hudson outside. That river, sprawling and relentless just beyond the diner's foggy windows, became a symbol of something Jim couldn't shake as he sat there. The Hudson had seen centuries of struggle, Revolutionary War battles, industrial booms and busts, families saying goodbye at its banks as soldiers shipped out or came home broken. It carried history in its currents, just like Jim carried his own. He stared at it through the glass, imagining for a moment that its dark, swirling depths could swallow up the pain he felt, the guilt that gnawed at him over Lily's drawing, over Rosie's words. But rivers don't erase history. They just keep flowing, dragging everything along. And Jim knew he couldn't outrun his past any more than he could outrun that river. It was part of him, whether he wanted it or not. The door jingled again, snapping him out of his thoughts, and Jim's gaze shifted as a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Carl, one of the old-timers who frequented Rosie's. A grizzled Vietnam vet with a limp and a penchant for telling stories, Jim could only half follow through lip-reading. Carl tipped his worn baseball cap in Jim's direction, then made his way over, sliding into the booth without asking. He pulled out a small weathered photo from his wallet and set it on the table, a grainy shot of a young Carl with his platoon, smiling under a jungle canopy. Jim had seen it before, but today, Carl's eyes were different, clouded with something heavy as he tapped the photo and started speaking. Jim strained to follow, catching fragments. "Lost, half of 'em. Never stops hurting. But you keep going. For them." Carl's voice, though unheard, carried a weight Jim felt in his bones. Then Carl reached into his jacket and pulled out something else, a letter, yellowed with age, addressed to him in a handwriting Jim didn't recognize. Carl slid it across the table, his weathered hand trembling just slightly. "Found this D at the V, meant for you. From Danny's wife." Jim's world tilted again, his stomach dropping as he stared at the envelope. Danny's wife. He hadn't heard from her since the memorial, hadn't had the courage to face her after he came back, and Danny didn't. His fingers hovered over the letter, hesitating, as Carl watched with quiet patience. Jim could feel the eyes of the diner on him again, or maybe it was just his own paranoia, but the weight of that unopened letter was suffocating. What could she possibly have to say after all these years? An apology? Blame? A plea for answers he didn't have? Every possibility felt like a landmine, ready to blow apart the fragile stability he'd clung to. He wanted to shove it back at Carl to pretend it didn't exist, but the older man just nodded as if saying, "You've got to face this, son," before getting up and limping back to his usual spot at the counter. Alone again, Jim held the letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Danny's face flashed in his mind, laughing over cheap beers in the barracks, promising they'd both make it home to grill steaks and watch the Super Bowl. Promises broken by a split second, by a roadside littered with death. Jim's throat burned as he slipped the letter into his jacket alongside Lily's drawing, two pieces of paper that felt like anchors dragging him under. He couldn't read it here, not with the diner's fluorescent lights and the clatter of life around him, but he knew he couldn't ignore it forever. The past was catching up, whether he was ready or not. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time blurred as Jim sat there, the untouched coffee growing cold. The diner started to empty out, the lunch rush coming and going, and still he couldn't move. Lily's signs, Rosie's words, Carl's letter. They swirled in his head, a cacophony he couldn't hear but could feel pressing down on him. He pulled out Lily's drawing again, smoothing it on the table, tracing the crayon sun with a calloused finger. My hero. The words mocked him, yet they also tugged at something buried deep. A flicker of the man he used to be, the one who believed in fighting for something bigger than himself. Could he still be that man? Or was he too far gone, too shattered by war and loss and silence? Then, as the afternoon light turned golden, slanting through the diner's windows and casting long shadows across the floor, Jim made a decision. It wasn't a loud moment, not a grand declaration, but it was seismic in its quiet intensity. He couldn't keep running from his ghosts, couldn't keep hiding behind the silence of his world. Not when a little girl believed in him, not when Danny's wife had words waiting to be read, not when the Hudson outside kept flowing with the weight of history he couldn't escape. He pulled out his notepad, his hand steadier now, and wrote a note to Rosie, asking her to get Lily's mom's contact info. He didn't know what he'd say, didn't know if he could face the letter or the memories it held, but he knew he had to try. For Lily, for Danny, maybe even for himself. As he slid the note across the counter, his heart pounded with a mix of dread and something unfamiliar, resolve. He tucked the drawing and the letter back into his jacket, standing up with a slowness that belied the storm inside. Whatever came next, whether it was healing or more pain, he was stepping toward it, not away. And if you're as gripped by Jim's journey as I am telling it, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Jim turned toward the door, the bell jingling as he pushed it open, stepping into the crisp autumn air. The Hudson glittered in the distance, a silent witness to the battles still ahead. He didn't know if he could carry the weight of being someone's hero, didn't know if he could face the words in that letter or the memories they'd unearth, but for the first time in years, he felt the tiniest crack in his armor, a sliver of light breaking through. And as he walked down the cracked sidewalk, leaves crunching under his boots, he made a silent promise to himself. No more running. Whatever truth waited for him, he'd face it head-on, even if it broke him all over again. The autumn air bit at Jim's skin as he stood outside Rosie's diner, the bell's jingle fading behind him. His boots crunched against the fallen leaves scattered across the cracked sidewalk, each step feeling heavier than the last. The note he'd left for Rosie, asking for Lily's mum's contact information, burned in his mind like a live wire. It was a small action, just a few scribbled words on a worn notepad, but it carried the weight of a decision he couldn't take back. For years he'd built walls around himself, brick by brick, silence by silence, shutting out the world to protect what little was left of his fractured soul. And now, with that one note, he'd cracked a door open. The Hudson glimmered in the distance under the fading golden light of late afternoon, its dark currents a mirror to the turmoil inside him. What if he wasn't ready for this? What if reaching out to Lily and her mum, or facing Danny's wife through that unopened letter, only dragged him deeper into the mire of guilt and loss he'd fought so hard to escape? His hand brushed against the pocket of his faded army jacket, feeling the crinkle of Lily's crayon drawing and the stiff edge of the letter from Danny's wife. 2 pieces of paper, 2 grenades waiting to detonate, and he'd just lit the fuse. As he walked the half-mile back to his tiny apartment above the hardware store, the world felt sharper, more invasive, as if every rustle of leaves and every distant flicker of a passing car's headlights was a reminder of how exposed he'd become. His chest tightened with every step, a vice of dread squeezing harder the closer he got to home. What was he even going to say to Lily's mom if Rosie got him the number? How could he explain the mess of a man he was to someone who'd put him on a pedestal through a child's innocent eyes? And that letter, God, that letter. The thought of Danny's wife's words waiting for him, penned years ago, maybe full of pain or anger or questions he had no answers for, made his stomach churn. He'd spent so long running from those ghosts, convincing himself that silence was safety, that staying invisible was the only way to survive. Now the past was clawing its way back, and he'd invited it in. His scarred hand clenched into a fist at his side, the old ache in his bones flaring as if his body itself was warning him to turn back, to rip up that note and bury everything again. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Not after Lily's signs had pierced through him, not after Rosie's quiet insistence that he mattered, not after Carl's weathered gaze had pushed that letter across the table like a challenge. The tension coiled tighter inside him, a spring ready to snap as he reached the rusted metal staircase leading up to his apartment. Each creak of the steps under his weight echoed the question pounding in his head. Was he strong enough to face what came next, or would it finally break him for good? Inside, the dim light of a single bulb cast long shadows across the sparse room. The air smelled of stale coffee and the faint mildew of a place barely lived in, just existed in. Jim sank into the threadbare armchair by the window, the springs groaning under him, and pulled out the 2 pieces of paper from his jacket. He set Lily's drawing on the small table beside him, the crayon sun staring back like a beacon he didn't know how to follow. Then, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, he held the letter from Danny's wife. The envelope was yellowed, the ink of his name smudged slightly, as if it had been handled too many times before finding its way to him. His thumb traced the edge, hesitating, every instinct screaming at him to shove it back into the darkness of a drawer and let it rot there. But Carl's words from the diner rang in his mind, unspoken but felt. "You've got to face this, son." And Lily's clumsy signs, "You're brave," cut through the fog of fear. He wasn't brave, hadn't been for years, but maybe pretending to be, just for a moment, was enough to rip the envelope open before he could change his mind. The paper crinkled under his fingers, the soundless act deafening in his silent world, as he unfolded the letter with a slowness that felt like defusing a bomb. The handwriting was tight, careful, as if every word had been chosen with pain. Jim's grey eyes scanned the lines, his heart slamming against his ribs as he pieced together the message through the blur of emotion clouding his vision. She didn't blame him. That was the first thing that hit him, a punch of relief so sharp it almost hurt. Danny's wife Sarah wrote of the day they got the news, how she'd clung to the hope that Jim had made it back, how she'd prayed every night that he'd carry on for both of them. "Danny talked about you like a brother," she wrote, her words tilting in places as if her hand had shaken. "He said if anything happened, you'd be the one to keep his stories alive. I know you've got your own scars, Jim. I see them even if I've never met you since. But please don't let his laugh die with him. He'd want you to live, not just survive." She went on to say she'd tried to find him sooner, had written this letter 3 years after Danny's death, but the VA lost it in a shuffle of paperwork until Carl stumbled across it recently. Every sentence felt like a brick being lifted off Jim's chest, only to be replaced by a heavier one made of raw, aching loss. She wasn't asking for answers or apologies. She was asking him to remember Danny the way he was before the sand and smoke, before the silence. And at the bottom, in a final shaky line, she'd written, If you ever want to talk, I'm here. For Danny. For you. Jim's breath came in shallow gasps, the letter slipping from his fingers to the table as his scarred face crumpled. Tears he hadn't shed in years spilled over, hot and unstoppable, carving paths down his cheeks into the jagged line of his old wound. He didn't try to hide them this time, didn't turn away from the empty room as if someone might see. The guilt he'd carried for so long, the weight of failing Danny didn't vanish, it never would, but Sarah's words shifted something, like a stone rolling just enough to let a sliver of light through. She saw him as Danny's brother, not his killer. She wanted him to live, not just exist. The pain of that truth, of being given permission to let go of some of the shame, was worse than any flashback, worse than the silence that had swallowed his world. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the wild thrum of a heart that hadn't dared hope in over a decade, and let the sobs come, silent but shattering, as the walls he'd built trembled under the weight of forgiveness he didn't know he'd been craving. Hours later, when the tears had dried and the room felt a little less suffocating, Jim sat staring at the phone on the table. Rosie had texted him. How she'd gotten his number he didn't ask, with Lily's mum's contact info and a short message. Her name's Emily. She's expecting your call. Go easy on yourself, Jim. He hadn't used the phone for much beyond emergencies in years. The vibrations of an incoming message often the only way he knew someone was reaching out. Now his fingers hovered over the screen, the act of typing a simple text feeling like scaling a mountain. What could he say? How could he thank a little girl for breaking him open in a way that somehow felt like healing? He typed and deleted, until finally he settled on something short, raw. This is Jim from the diner. Thank you for Lily's drawing. It means more than I can say. Can we meet again? He hit send before doubt could stop him, the phone vibrating softly in confirmation, and then he waited, the silence of his world heavier than ever as the minutes ticked by. When Emily's reply came, a quick, "Of course, tomorrow at Rosie's, noon?" Jim felt the ground shift beneath him again, a mix of relief and terror flooding his veins. Tomorrow. He had less than a day to figure out how to face a child who'd called him a hero when he felt anything but. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Flashbacks crept in as they always did, but mixed with them were newer images, Lily's shy grin, the crayon sun, Sarah's handwriting telling him to live. When dawn broke, grey and cold through the window, Jim woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He moved through his morning routine with a quiet purpose, splashing cold water on his face to chase away the ghosts, pulling on the same faded army jacket, but pausing as he caught his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man staring back looked the same, scarred, weathered, hollow-eyed, but there was something different in the set of his jaw, a flicker of resolve where there'd only been resignation before. He couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep carrying the weight of the past like a punishment. If Sarah could see him as Danny's brother, if Lily could see him as a hero, maybe, just maybe, he could start seeing himself as something more than a broken soldier. But it meant letting go of something, sacrificing the armor of silence and solitude he'd clung to. It meant stepping into a world where he risked being hurt again, where he risked failing again. As he tucked Lily's drawing into his pocket once more, he made a silent vow to try, even if it meant falling apart all over again. He'd lived through war. He could live through this. By the time noon rolled around, Jim was back at Rosie's, sitting in his usual booth, his hands wrapped around a fresh mug of coffee, more for something to hold on to than to drink. The diner hummed with the familiar bustle of lunchtime, the air thick with the scent of burgers and fries, but all Jim could feel was the knot in his chest as he watched the door. When the bell jingled and Emily walked in, Lily bouncing at her side in that same pink coat, his heart lurched. The little girl's face lit up when she spotted him, her stuffed bunny swinging as she tugged her mum toward the booth. Emily offered a small, nervous smile, her eyes kind but searching, as if trying to figure out who Jim really was beneath the jacket and the scars. They slid into the seat across from him, and for a long moment no one moved, the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force. Then Lily, with that same determined look she'd had the day before, raised her tiny hand and signed, "Hi," her fingers a little steadier this time. Jim's throat tightened, but he managed to sign back, a rusty "hi" of his own, the gesture feeling foreign, yet right. Emily watched, her expression softening, and then she spoke, her lips moving slowly so he could follow. "Lily's been talking about you non-stop since yesterday. She sees her grandpa in you, I think. He was everything to her. And losing him hit hard. I hope this isn't too much for you, Jim. I just couldn't say no to her wanting to see you again." Her words carried an apology, but also a quiet strength, and Jim felt the last of his defenses crumble. He pulled out his notepad, scribbling quickly, his handwriting shaky but clear. "It's not too much. I didn't know about her grandpa. I'm sorry, but I'm glad she's here." He slid the note across, and as Emily read it, her eyes glistened with something like relief. Lily, oblivious to the undercurrent of emotion, reached into her coat and pulled out another drawing, this one showing two stick figures, one in green, one in pink, holding hands under a big heart. She pushed it toward Jim with a proud grin, signing friends with a little wiggle of excitement. Jim's chest cracked open all over again, a warmth spreading through the cold spaces inside him as he took the paper, his rough fingers brushing against the crayon lines. For the first time in years, he let himself smile, a small, crooked thing but real, and signed friends back to her. In that moment, something shifted permanently. Jim knew he'd never be the man he was before Kandahar, before the blast, before the silence. The scars, both visible and hidden, would always be there, and the ghosts of Danny and Marcus and all the others would never fully leave. But sitting across from Lily and Emily, seeing the hope in a child's eyes and the understanding in her mother's, he felt a piece of himself come back to life, a piece he thought had died on a dusty road halfway across the world. Over the next hour they talked, through signs, through notes, through Emily's patient translations, and Jim learned more about Lily's grandpa, a man who'd fought in Desert Storm and come home quieter but never broken. He shared a little too, writing brief stories of Danny's laugh and Marcus's bad jokes, the first time he'd let himself remember them without drowning in guilt. It wasn't easy, every word a battle, but it was a start. And as Lily giggled at a doodle he sketched of her bunny on his notepad, Jim realized he was fighting a new kind of war now, one for connection, for healing, for a life worth living. Later that week, Jim made another decision, one that felt like a surrender and a victory all at once. He drove to the local cemetery just outside Poughkeepsie, a quiet place where the Hudson's shadow fell over rows of headstones. In his jacket pocket, alongside Lily's drawings, was his Purple Heart, the medal he'd earned at a cost he'd never stopped paying. He hadn't looked at it in years, had kept it buried in a box under his bed, a reminder of everything he'd lost. Now, as he stood before a small, weathered marker bearing the name of a local vet he'd never met, but felt tied to through shared battles, he pulled the medal out. The ribbon was faded, the metal scratched, but it still carried the weight of sacrifice. Jim knelt, his knees pressing into the cold earth, and placed the medal against the stone, a silent offering, a renunciation of the shame he'd tied to it. "I'm trying," he mouthed to no one, or maybe to everyone he'd lost, as the wind whipped around him, carrying away years of unspoken burdens. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was a step toward living with the past instead of being crushed by it. Days turned into weeks, and Jim's routine began to change in ways he hadn't expected. He still came to Rosie's every morning, still sat in his usual booth, but now there were familiar faces waiting for him. Lily and Emily joined him when they could, the little girl teaching him new signs with a patience that made him laugh despite himself. Carl and the other old-timers started pulling up chairs, sharing stories through scribbled notes and slow lip-reading, rebuilding a camaraderie Jim thought he'd never feel again. He even started volunteering at the VA hospital, not in the job he'd been rejected for, but as a quiet presence sitting with other vets who understood the silence, both literal and emotional. He wrote to Sarah, too, a short letter thanking her for her words, promising to keep Danny's stories alive and asking if they could meet one day. Her reply came quickly, full of warmth, setting a date for the following month. Each step was small, each connection fragile, but they were threads weaving into something stronger, a tapestry of a life he was daring to reclaim. On a crisp November evening, as the first snow dusted the streets of Poughkeepsie, Jim stood by the window of his apartment looking out at the Hudson's dark expanse. In his hand was Lily's latest drawing, this one showing their stick figures under a snowy sky, tiny white dots scribbled around them. On the table behind him, a small frame held a photo he'd dug out from the bottom of a drawer, a shot of him and Danny, grinning in fatigues under a blazing Afghan sun. For so long, he'd hidden from that image, from the pain it carried, but now it sat in the open, a reminder not just of loss but of brotherhood. The river outside flowed on, indifferent to the wars fought on its banks or in the hearts of men like Jim, a timeless witness to struggle and survival. And as he traced the crayon snowflakes on Lily's drawing, Jim felt a quiet truth settle over him. Healing isn't a destination, but a journey, as relentless and unpredictable as the Hudson itself. War breaks us in ways words can't name, but sometimes, in the smallest gestures, a child's clumsy sign, a letter's forgiveness, a medal left on cold stone, we find the pieces to rebuild. It's not about erasing the silence, but learning to live within it, to let light sneak through the cracks. If Jim's story has touched something in you, if it's reminded you of the battles fought quietly every day, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment, "I believe in healing" below. Share this with someone who needs to know they're seen, that they matter, because stories like this remind us we're never as alone as we feel. And if you want to stick around for more journeys of heartbreak and hope, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.